The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Its translation began with 72 Jewish scholars in Alexandria, Egypt around 250 BC. The Septuagint was the official Old Testament for Greek-speaking Jews and later for the early Christians. The translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into the Greek language was a very significant event for the Jews. Clement of Alexandria wrote that it was the biggest event since the time of Ezra. For it was the counsel of God carried out for the benefit of Grecian ears. It was not alien to the inspiration of God who gave the prophecy, also to produce the translation, and make it, as it were, Greek prophecy. Since the Scriptures having perished in the captivity of Nebuchadnezzar, Ezra the Levite, the priest, in the time of Artaxerxes, king of the Persians, having become inspired in the exercise of prophecy, restored again the whole of the ancient Scriptures. From the time of its translation, through the time of Jesus Christ and the Apostles, and through the time of the early Christians, it was called the translation of the 70. Augustine of Hippo was the first to call it the Septuagint, which is Latin for of the 70. It is abbreviated with the Roman numerals LXX. This video is an introduction to the Septuagint. There are other videos in this series which will go into more detail. Links to these supplemental videos are on the screen and in the description. They are History of the Septuagint, Notable differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, Notable New Testament quotations that follow the Septuagint. There are two ancient sources for the history of the Septuagint. The first is the letter of Aristeas. This is a primary source, which means it was written around the same time that the Septuagint was being translated. Aristeas was a witness to, and had a hand in, how the Septuagint came to be. His letter goes into great detail on how this happened. The other source is the writings of Jews who lived in the first century, such as Philo of Alexandria and Josephus. The short version of the Septuagint's beginning is this. Ptolemy II, the Greek king of Egypt, wanted to expand the library at Alexandria. He sent a letter to Eleazar, the high priest in Jerusalem, to send men to translate the Jewish scriptures into Greek for his library. Eleazar appointed 72 scholars who traveled to Alexandria to do this. At the lighthouse of Alexandria, these 72 men translated the books of Moses, that is, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, also called the Pentateuch, in 72 days. Over the next 150 years, many more Old Testament books were added to the Septuagint. From the day of its completion, the Septuagint was highly praised by all the Jews, even until the time of Jesus and the Apostles. For details on how the Septuagint came to be, and about the popular legend behind it, see the full video on the history of the Septuagint. If one looked at the ancient Old Testament manuscripts that we have today, one would notice differences between them. As copies were made of copies, differences arose. This is true with the Old Testament manuscripts as well as New Testament manuscripts. If one was to take the Old Testament manuscripts and combine the ones that are most similar, one would categorize them into three families. The three families of Old Testament manuscripts are the Samaritan, the Septuagint, and the Masoretic. The Samaritan family of manuscripts is the oldest. Their manuscript tradition goes back to the time when the exiles returned from Babylonian captivity, which was in the 400s BC. Ezra and Nehemiah lived during this time period. The Samaritans accepted only the 5 books of Moses. Thus, their Old Testament is called the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Septuagint family of manuscripts began with the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek around 250 BC, which is what this video series is about. This became the Old Testament for Greek and Aramaic-speaking Jews. The third family of manuscripts is the Masoretic text, which is today's complete Old Testament in the Hebrew language. These were copied and collected centuries after Jesus Christ. This family of manuscripts can be traced back to a Jewish group called the Masoretes, who lived in the 900s AD and a little before. When translating the Old Testament for our English Bibles, Practically all English translations use the Masoretic text. This is surprising considering that the Masoretic family is actually more recent than the Samaritan and the Septuagint families by 1300 years and 1100 years respectively. There are noticeable differences between the Masoretic and the Septuagint. For example, the Septuagint contains additional Old Testament books as well as additions to Masoretic books such as Esther and Daniel. These were formally included in the Old Testament for centuries. Protestants were the first to begin calling some of these books Apocrypha. For a list of the major differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, including the additional books in the Septuagint, see the third video in this series. Both the Greek and the Hebrew Old Testaments existed during the time of Jesus and the Apostles. Since we know the Greek Septuagint and the Hebrew Masoretic, as we have them today, have some differences, are we able to know which Old Testament Jesus and the Apostles used? Did they favor the Hebrew of their day or the Greek? If there was a set of scriptures that Jesus and the Apostles used, when you compare today's Greek Septuagint with today's Masoretic Hebrew, they certainly favored the Greek, not the Hebrew. Here is how we know. The New Testament quotes the Old Testament a few hundred times. We can compare the quotations and see if the New Testament writers used the Septuagint or the Masoretic. 20% of the quotations are the same in the Septuagint and the Masoretic, but 80% of the quotations differ between the two texts. So, of those quotations that differ, how often do the New Testament writers follow the Septuagint, and how often do they follow the Masoretic? Of these differences, 90% follow the Septuagint, while only 10% follow the Masoretic. In other words, New Testament quotations from the Old Testament favor the Septuagint over the Masoretic 9 times out of 10. No wonder the early Christians used the Septuagint as their Old Testament, because Jesus and the Apostles used it as well. Additionally, it is worth noting that the Greek Septuagint contains many more prophecies about Jesus being the Messiah than the Masoretic does. If time permits, and if you viewers are interested, I might make this video series on the Septuagint an ongoing series by sharing specific New Testament quotations from the Old Testament that differ between the Septuagint and the Masoretic. For example, one Old Testament passage that differs is Isaiah 7:14, about the prophecy of how the Messiah will be born. Would he be born of a virgin or of a young woman? There is a distinction between these in the two texts. Another example is the many differences in Psalm 22. The Septuagint contains more prophecies about Jesus' crucifixion than the Masoretic does. To learn more about these differences and why the Septuagint was the Old Testament of choice for Jesus, the Apostles, and the early Christians, see the fourth video in this series. I hope this has piqued your interest in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Greek Old Testament has great value. The early Christians recognized it and used it as their Old Testament, not only because it contains more prophecies proving that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah, but also because Jesus and the Apostles used it far more often than the Hebrew Old Testament. To learn more about the Septuagint, please see the rest of the videos in this series. If you are new to this channel, I invite you to watch videos about early Christianity. Please subscribe to stay tuned for future videos. Thank you for watching.